All right, we're continuing now, and now I have a person in my lap. So now we're doing. So now we're doing cold read with Hound Dog, and Keith and Yellow Lab on her bed down there. All right, so now you just calm down and shut up, okay? All right, just let mommy read. All right, hopefully he'll fall asleep in a second. Okay, where were we? Orsatti's report was finished first. He handed the single sheet to the radio man, and Sparks read, "The jewel-like objects which we have discovered here in Torms seems to be unique. So far as my personal knowledge goes, they have never been reported elsewhere on Mars. We picked them up all over the city. Apparently the first expedition discovered them, for we found several in their ship, one under the commander's bunk, others near the vessel. They appear either singly or in groups that may run as high as several hundreds. In one place we found thousands of them piled, as Captain Froome described it, like coal in front of a basement door. It is doubtful that they belonged to the unknown inhabitants of the city. A more likely hypothesis is that they had been brought here after the inhabitants died. In appearance, they much resembled gigantic jewels, and at first glance they seem to have been carved in definite facets. A more careful examination, however, discloses that the facets are natural and apparently result from the crystalline structure of these strange objects. Another unique characteristic is their fragility. Sutter dropped one of them, and it shattered into fragments so minute as to be almost invisible. And then, to add to our uncertainty about these crystals, the fragments rapidly dissolved into thin red gas, which seems to have a tendency to flow together. We have as yet not been able to suggest an adequate explanation for the origin of these crystals, or to determine what they really are. Signed, Vincent Orsatti, biochemist with the rescue expedition to Torms." Sparks snapped a series of switches. A transformer hummed, radio tubes warmed. He spoke into the microphone. "Rescue ship Kepler calling main base." "Go ahead, rescue ship," the loudspeaker answered. By the time he had finished the first message, Sutter had completed his report. Sparks started reading the archaeologist's account into the microphone. "Unquestionably, this is the most important archaeological discovery made since the first ship landed on Mars 11 years ago. It is not necessary for me to recount here the explorations made since that date. You recall the eagerness with which the first exploratory efforts were carried out, the hurried, frantic search for intelligent life on Mars. There was never any question that life had existed here. Dust had almost filled the canals, dust covered the sites, but the canals and the sites proved that a race of remarkable scientific achievement had developed on this planet. You recall how our eagerness faded into wonder as the reports of the exploring parties came in. They found cities with sand drifting down the streets. The condition of the cities indicated that they had been abandoned in a manner which suggested that the inhabitants had slowly fled before an advancing enemy. We found tools scattered everywhere. Ornaments, the strange scroll books covered with indecipherable hieroglyphics, but we never found the race that had created these things. We found their bones, dry in the sand, but we never found them, nor did we find the enemy before which they had fled. Nor are there any inhabitants here in the city of Torms, but there is something here that I regard as very significant. Here, everything is in perfect order. The books are neatly stacked in the shelves, because, Martians, books, why not? The contents of the few houses we entered are in place, and the tools and engines of the race that built this city are packed in the equivalent of cosmoline, a heavy grease that protects them from rusting. Sure, why not? Everything here is in perfect order, as if the owners plan to return at some future day. A secret is hidden here, a secret that may account for the disappearance of the race that once inhabited Mars. This city is newer than any of the others we've found. It was abandoned last. The clue to the fate of the life on this planet is here. Upon the desirability of determining the fate of this people, of solving the vast mystery that shrouds the planet, I need not comment. I therefore recommend that the most careful investigation be made here. Signed, James Sutter." Sparks took a deep breath. "End of the second report," he said. "Well, it sounds interesting," the speaker said, "but have you got any dope on what happened to the first expedition?" "It'll be along in a minute," Sparks answered. "Well, all right, don't snap my head off," the speaker grated. The operator's voice trailed into suddenly embarrassed silence. "Oh, Avery, I'm sorry. I just forgot." "Skip it," the radio man said gruffly. "I'm not asking for any sympathy." He looked up. Captain Frome, his face looking as if it had been chiseled from granite, stood beside him. Transmit this," Frome said. He laid his hand on the radio operator's shoulder. His fingers dug into the flesh. Sparks didn't feel them. He read the message. "Okay," he said. "That's what I wanted to know." Frome's voice was suspiciously husky. "Lad, I'm sorry." "You can skip that, too," Sparks answered. Frome walked away. The operator's voice droned into the microphone, repeating the message Frome had given him. October 16th, 2347. When radio signals of the first expedition to Torms ceased coming through, we were sent to ascertain if the expedition was in trouble. This is a report of what we found. We sighted the ship from the air. It was resting in one of the squares peculiar to Martian cities. We landed as near to it as we could in a nearby square, and immediately Orzati, Sutter, and myself walked to the ship, leaving Avery, our radio operator, McIlrath, our engineer, and Adams, our cook, to guard our own vessel. I regret to inform you that we found the 3 members of the first expedition dead. We were unable to determine the cause of death. There were no wounds on their bodies, but the expression on their faces indicated that they had died in agony. Commander Richard Avery was in his bunk. His legs and arms, stiffened in death, were drawn up in a position that hinted that he had been aroused from slumber and had tried to defend himself. However, this is merely an impression. No evidence substantiates it. Samuel Funk, the archaeologist, was at the radio transmitter. The impression I received was that he died trying to call for help. The radio set was dead because of power failure, which is utterly incredible, for the power that fed the set was drawn directly from the uranium fission driving engines, which had ceased to operate. In my personal experience, this is the first and only time a uranium fission engine has failed to function. I can suggest no reason for this failure. However, the engines are dead. We tested them. John Orms, language expert who was attempting to decipher the Martian language, was found at some distance from the ship. His tracks in the sand indicated that he had fled from the vessel. The same agony was on his face. In an effort to determine if the ship had been attacked, we examined the sand near it. No footprints, other than those made by the 3 men, were found. We buried them in the sand of the square in which their ship had landed. We will make a complete investigation. It's essential that we know not only what caused their deaths, but what stopped the engines of their ship. Also, we will attempt to solve the mystery of this city, as indicated by James Sutter, our archaeologist. Signed, Martin Frome, captain of the rescue ship Kepler. Sparks' steady voice faltered. He swallowed. Then he spoke again. "This is the end of the transmission at this time." He snapped off the transmitter. There was silence in the ship. Sparks looked at the radio equipment, saying nothing. He raised his head when a voice spoke. "You're a hard man, Martin Frome." It was Angus McIlrath. In moments of stress, the burr of his far-distant homeland appeared in his voice. "You need not remind me of that fact, Angus," Frome answered. "Skip it, Angus," said Sparks bluntly. "But 'twas your own fatherland." Father is spelled Faither. Father, lad, that they buried here. Sorry, it was your own father that they buried here. The least they could have done was tell you as soon as they returned what they had found, instead of making you wait and learn it from the messages. He turned to Frome. "I say it again, you're a hard man." "This is a hard planet, Angus, and it's a hard trail we travel getting here. It is no place for weakness of any kind." "Aye, but—" "I said to forget it, Angus," Sparks interrupted. "My father was a hard man, too. If he had not been, he would not have been what he was, the first human to set foot on Mars. I know very well that he was called Old Find a Way or Make One, Avery. Old damn the risk we're going through. Giggling. Whenever anything went wrong, and everything must have gone wrong on that first trip, he had a saying: for every evil, nature provides a cure. But she doesn't hand you that cure on a silver platter. You've got to find it yourself or die. He hated any show of sentiment, any weakness of any kind. Captain Frome told me my father was dead in exactly the way he would have wished the news to reach me. As to his death, he died as he would have wished, fighting the unknown. He's buried where he would have wished to be, in the sand of Mars. Silence followed the radio operator's outburst, the awkward silence of men who would want to show their sympathy and can't find the words. I was on that first trip with him, said McIlrath. I learned to know him. You're his own true son. Sorry, Sparks answered. I didn't mean to blow off steam that way. He wouldn't have liked it. But he was always sort of a god to me, and his lips tightened. Something killed him. The central door opened. The cook stood there. Come and get it, he said, or I'll throw it away. Come on, said Sparks bitterly. Let's go eat. When they left the room, the jewel was lying on the table where Orzati had been examining it. When they returned, it was gone. Indeed. They searched the ship for it. They didn't find it. They didn't even find a tiny opening in the inner hall down near the floor, a hole that looked as if a rivet might have been dropped out of it. Yeah, they didn't even find a hole. The hole was no larger than a lead pencil, which was probably why they missed it. There was another tiny opening in the outer shell of the ship. The jewel was gone. Gentlemen, said Captain Frum, tonight we will take turns standing guard. But nothing happened that night. No intruder tried to gain entrance to the ship. The wind of Mars, blowing the dry dust of the red planet, whimpered softly around the vessel. There was no other sound. But what happened the next day made them forget, temporarily at least, all about the jewel that had disappeared so mysteriously. Early in the morning, Sutter and Orzati went out to continue their investigation of the city. Frum remained in the ship, writing up a complete report. McIlrath, under orders from Frum, had gone to the vessel of the first expedition to examine the engines. He had returned, dourly shaking his head. The engines were dead. He had reported to Frum that he was unable to determine the cause of their failure, and muttering, had gone back to his own engine room. Sparks, on lookout duty at the port, saw the man coming. It was Sutter. He was running. "We've found them," Sutter gasped as he came through the inner door of the dock. "The inhabitants of Mars, in a cavern under the city. You remember that door where all the jewels were piled? We shoveled them out of the way and opened it. The Martians are down below, frozen asleep." He gasped in explanation. "Then they're alive?" Frum snapped. "Well, no, not yet, but they can be awakened, I think. Orzati says they can, and he ought to know. He's down there now." The archaeologist was so excited he couldn't speak coherently. Sparks knew what this find meant to Sutter. It meant a lot to all of them. One of the big reasons why men had been so anxious to blaze a trail across space to Mars had been to meet the inhabitants of the planet. Photographs taken in 1969 had showed conclusively that the canals of Mars were artificial. Therefore, I love books from 1954. Therefore, there was life on the sister world across the void. But when they reached the planet, they hadn't found the men of Mars. Instead, they found desolation and dust and sand and death, deserted cities. If Sutter was right, this was the big moment in the history of the exploration of Mars. Even the arrival of the first spaceship from Earth was not as important as this discovery. His heart leaped at the thought. The long-lost inhabitants of Mars had been found. Frum began jerking on heavy clothing. That sentence didn't go the way I thought it was going to go.
Phrasing.
Phrasing! Get into your clothes, lad, he barked. And call Angus. Again, phrasing. And call Angus. He came here with the first ship, and he deserves to be present when we awaken one of these Martians. Sorry. Okay, calm down. Sparks, diving towards the engine room, realized that Frum had given no reason for taking him along. He had said that Angus deserved to be present. The old engineer did. He had suffered all the privations of the pioneer explorations to the planet. Sorry, I get tears in my eyes. I can't read things like privations. He had earned a chance to be present at the historic moment when one of the men of Mars was awakened. But Sparks knew why Frum was taking him. He hadn't earned his chance. Someone else who couldn't be present had earned it for him. He was only a youth, barely past 20. Only his superb knowledge of radio equipment had gotten him in place with the Martian explorers. His father had not opposed his coming, nor had he helped his son secure the appointment. He had said, "The fact that I am commander of the men exploring Mars will make no difference so far as you are concerned. You will suffer every hardship that anyone else suffers. You will take every risk. You will eat the same food, sleep in the same hard bunks, drink the same synthesized water, and stand directly on your own feet. You will ask no favors, and you will obey orders implicitly, no matter what they are. Father of the Year, ladies and gentlemen. Richard Avery had been a hard man, but he had been a man. Great for him. Only Shorty Adams was left to guard the ship. Frome gave him strict orders to be on the lookout. Sutter led them at a dog trot across the silent, deserted city to a low building that had only one door. Ruby crystals were scattered all around the door where he and Orzati had shoved them out of the way. Sutter dived into the dark opening, and as the others followed, Sparks saw how heavy that door was. It was at least a foot thick, and the outer surface was heavily pitted by rust. Cold read. I told you it was cold read. Orzati waited for them down below. They're here all right, he said. Each of these cells has a Martian in it. They're in frozen sleep, too, no doubt about it. The chamber was not large. It had been carved out of solid rock, and it had perhaps 500 coffin-like cells in it. Each receptacle was fitted with a glass top. I waited for your permission to open one of these receptacles, Captain Frome, Orzati continued. Pending your arrival, I took the liberty of removing the seals from one of the caskets. It's ready to open. Shall I go ahead? Frome hesitated. He peered through the glass top, studied the creature that lay within. Are you certain these people are really in frozen sleep? He asked. Positive of it. Feel the temperature down here. It's perfect for frozen sleep. That's why this city was in perfect order. The tools put away in Greece, the houses closed and locked. These people expected to return to their city when they awakened. Well, said Frome slowly, you may... What's wrong, Angus? McIlrath had stood apart from the others. He had taken a flashlight and poked carefully around the cavern, nosing down the aisles between the receptacles like a wary old hound scenting the presence of danger. Now he spoke. I'm not going to do the accent. I'm thinking that these people had a reason for putting themselves into suspended animation. They didn't come down here and hide away in this gloomy hole for no cause. I don't know what their reason was, but it could have been the last desperate expedient of a race fleeing from some deadly and implacable enemy. If this is true, we had best consider our action in awakening them. A little stir of uneasiness ran through the group. Orzati blinked owlishly. Sutter protested inarticulately. Have you seen anything that might consider an enemy strong enough to force the Martians to resort to frozen sleep to escape it? Frome questioned. I have not that. That's what it says. But perhaps their food supply gave out, Sutter protested. The water supply has been dwindling on this planet for ages. Perhaps a protracted period of drought left them with no choice except frozen sleep or starvation. They chose suspended animation, hoping that when they awakened, climate conditions would be better. Perhaps they had alternate cycles of drought and meager rainfall, and this was the way they escaped the drought. The old Scot shook his head. You may be right. Perhaps these Martians fled from drought, but I remember we came here to rescue 3 men. We found them dead. One of them had fled from their ship. What he fled, we do not know, but we do know that this race was also fleeing from something. Again, the little stir of uneasiness came. Was the old Scot sensing something that he could not put into words? We do that. Sutter was an archaeologist. He had spent years digging into the ruins of Mars. He would not be balked now. This is superstitious nonsense. It may be that, McIlrath answered. I think I know the 3 men who died here fairly well. There was little superstition in them, and I know very well indeed that uranium fission engines are not superstitious, but both the men and the engines are dead. You can't account for that by superstition. Sutter and Orzati turned to Frome and began to plead with him to permit the opening of one of the receptacles. Frome considered his decision. Well, the whole purpose of our exploration of this planet has been to discover the Martians. Having found them, if we fail to awaken them, our purpose is defeated. Therefore, you may open one of the receptacles. Sutter and Orzati wasted no time. Frome turned to McIlrath. I'm sorry, Angus. If you had a definite reason, we would have waited. Aye, Captain, McIlrath answered. Sparks Avery watched. He had taken no part in the conversation. Now, in spite of the dry, frigid air, globules of sweat began to form on his forehead. He brushed them away. Now and again his eyes strayed to the heavy pistol that hung at Frome's hip. Frome had opened the flap and loosened the pistol in his holster. There was a jewel on the floor near the end of the ramp that led downward. It glittered evilly in the sunlight that was beginning to shine into the cavern. It seemed to the radio operator that only minutes passed before Orzati had opened the receptacle. Very gently, he and Sutter lifted out its occupant. They laid him on the floor, this man of Mars. The men from Earth clustered about him. He was not quite 5 feet tall, had a huge chest and long, spindly arms. He was clad in a soft leather garment, and around his waist was a metal belt from which a pouch and a short dagger hung. In minutes he'll awaken, Orzati whispered. The others were silent. Sparks caught the suppressed tension of that moment. He had been on Mars less than 6 months, but he had absorbed from his father the lure of the red planet, the vast mystery of it. No, Dougal, I said someone who was lured there. Hmm? Sorry, are you falling asleep?
No.
Okay. You sure?
No.
No. He had been on Mars less than 6 months, fewer than 6 months, but he had absorbed from his father the lure of the red planet, the vast mystery of it. Now the mystery would be solved. Now Mars would have a voice. Now the red deserts would give up their secrets. Now the deserted cities would reveal what had happened in them. The Martian stirred. A little finger moved. An arm twisted. His chest heaved. The soft sigh of air through long, unused vocal cords echoed through the cavern. He's awakening, Sutter whispered. Heavens, what will he say? What will he do? What will he think? How amazed he will be to see us, strangers from another world, bending over him. They could be fucking terrified, but okay. As they watched, the chest movement of the Martian became more regular. The panting heaves that had marked his first gasping efforts for air smoothed into an even rhythm. Spasmodic twitching fluttered his throat. Look, the archaeologist's tense voice ran out. His eyes were opening. They were brown, an agate brown. They were filmed and out of focus. Easy, old fellow, Sutter whispered. Here, I'll help you sit up. He slipped an arm under the Martian's shoulder. The Martian glanced at Sutter and looked away. The film was gone from his eyes. They were in focus now. Sparks caught his breath. What he had seen was incredible. The Martian had only glanced at Sutter. Then he looked away. His eyes went to the faces of the others, but he only glanced at them too, glanced casually at them as if they were of no importance. Awaking from the sleep of ages, finding himself the captive of a race that obviously did not belong to Mars, he found them not worthy of a second glance. What was wrong? Couldn't the Martian see yet? Was he blind? Or, no matter how important were these giants who were bending over, was there something that was more important? The Martian had large, pointed ears which he could move at will. He twitched them backward like a cat listening for a sound behind him. He absolutely ignored the Earthmen. His ears flipped forward toward the open doorway through which the sun was shining. He listened. There was no sound. He moved his head from side to side, his ears questing for some sound in the cold, dry air, his eyes alert for movement. Sparks found himself listening too. He heard nothing, but the Martian seemed to hear something. His ears were flipped forward with the intenseness of a cat that has heard the growl of a dangerous dog. But he was no longer listening. He was looking. He saw something. The agate brown eyes were fixed with terrible intentness on an object near the doorway. Fear crept over his face, a horror and a terror that was akin to madness. He jerked himself free from Sutter's arms. The archaeologist tried to hold him. He wrenched himself free. The hand darted to the dagger at his belt. It rose evilly upward and sank in the Martian's throat. He screeched. The screech died in a gurgle. He fell forward on his face, and a cloud of dry dust puffed up from under his dead body. In the shocked, stunned silence, Sutter hoarsely gasped, "We scared him. He saw us and committed suicide?" "No," Sparks jerked out. "He saw us all right, but we didn't scare him. He didn't pay attention to us. There's that thing that scared him." He pointed towards the doorway where the ruby jewel glinted in the sunlight. "That's what he saw, that thing. It scared him so badly that he committed suicide." He started to approach the jewel. "Drop it," McIlrath's voice rang out. "Don't touch that thing." Sparks leapt away. "The lad's right," Angus continued. "I was watching. The Martian paid us no heed. It was yon jewel that scarred him." "That's preposterous," Sutter protested. "That jewel is harmless. We'll open another receptacle, revive another Martian." "We'll do nothing of the kind," Frome snapped. Preposterous or not, this demands a full investigation. When the first Martian we find commits suicide as soon as we awaken him, I'm going to know why he did it before we awaken another. Sutter, you and Orzati pick up his body. We'll take it to the ship, make a complete report to our main base, and ask that a large expedition be sent here. Angus, you lead the way. Sparks, you follow him, and I'll bring up the rear. He jerked the pistol from its holster. The click as he slipped a cartridge into the chamber was loud in the silent vault. Overruling Sutter's objections, he ordered them from the vault. They obeyed him. As he walked up the incline, he picked up the jewel and swiftly thrust it into his knapsack. He closed the door of the cavern as they left. In the minds of each of them was a single question. Why did the Martian commit suicide? Why had that jewel scared him so badly? That's more than one question. Was death silent and invisible here in this haunted city? Had the Martians fled from death? When they reached the ship, they found that death was there ahead of them. They found Shorty Adams curled up under the water cooler in his own galley. He was dead. Oh, no, poor Shorty. Sparks found him and called the others. Frome got there first. His examination of the body was swift but thorough. This happened almost as soon as we left the ship. There's no wound on his body, no sign to show the cause of death, but his face is stamped with that same agony that was on the faces of the first three. Methodically, he began to search the galley. From an open bin, he pulled another jewel. Frome's face seemed to freeze. He was still wearing the heavy gloves that are standard equipment in the open of Mars. Handling the jewel gingerly, he raised it up to the level of his eyes, squinted at it. Shaking his head, he said, I can't tell whether it's the same one we brought into the ship last night. Do you think while we were at dinner, Adams slipped into the other room and stole it? Sutter asked. That is not true, said McIlrath flatly. How do you know it isn't? It could be true. I knew Adams, the old Scot said. He was no thief. But how did he get it out of the ship, or where was it hidden? Are you suggesting it moved of its own accord? Sutter persisted. Enough, Frome interrupted decisively. Something killed him. I'm not prepared to say this jewel was responsible for his death. I'm not prepared to say it wasn't. But I am saying this. We're going to our main base immediately, where complete laboratory facilities are available, and we're going to find out what these things really are. Angus, prepare your engines for an immediate takeoff. Sparks, he barked, warm up your transmitter and make contact with our main base immediately. Report that we're coming in. Get moving. Sparks was already racing towards the bow of the ship. As he slid into the seat before the transmitter, he saw, out of the corner of his eyes, the body of the dead Martian where Sutter and Orzati had dropped it when they entered the ship. The dagger was still sticking from his throat. The sight sent a touch of eerie chill up his spine. If he had needed anything to remind him that some incredible form of death lurked very near, the sight of the dagger protruding from the Martian provided it. He snapped the switches, reached automatically for the microphone. When no transformer hum came, he snapped the switches again. He was still working with them when Frome entered the room. I regret to report, he said, that our transmitter is dead. The power seems to have failed. Frome stopped in mid-stride. He would have halted like that if somebody had suddenly pulled a gun on him. What's that? As Sparks repeated the words, Sutter and Orzati entered the room. But the power for our radio transmitter is drawn from our main engines, Frome whispered. Then he spun on his heel, brushed past Orzati and Sutter, and was gone. What's going on? Orzati asked bewilderedly. I have a hunch I know, Sparks answered. He pounded after the captain. When he reached the engine room, he needed only a glance to see that his worst fear had come true. But the engines can't be dead, Frome was saying vehemently. They can't be. It's impossible for uranium fission engines to fail. Yet here we are. I know it's impossible, the old engineer replied stubbornly, but I'm telling you, it happened anyhow. Captain Frome faced the tense little group. Gentlemen, he said, I need not remind you that we are face to face with a new and unknown form of death. Night is coming. We are without power to move the ship or to operate our radio apparatus. There are hundreds of miles of dry, deadly deserts surrounding the city. Deserts which we could not hope to cross on foot. We have food and water for 2 weeks. Unquestionably, when our main base cannot raise us by radio, they will send a rescue ship, but it will be a week before a rescue expedition can reach us. If we are to be numbered among the living when it arrives, the price we will pay for our lives is constant vigilance. Pistols will be issued to all of you. Keep them ready at all times. He paused and looked at the engineer. Angus, you and Sparks will make every effort to determine the cause of our engine failure and to correct it. Sutter, you will do me the great favor if you will take charge of the galley. Orzati, I would like you to help me. Certainly. What are we to do? We are going to find out what these things really are, Frome answered. He pointed to the 2 jewels. The biochemist paled. Working on the engines, it was obvious that the old engineer was trying to conceal his fears. To all questions, he returned the same answer, a perturbed shake of the head. I dinna know, lad. It is as if the uranium has lost its power to explode. But it hasn't been touched. The seals are in place. If anyone had tampered with it, he would have left marks behind him. I know that, lad, and I'm remembering that there were no marks on the bodies of the dead men either. But what could have done it? I dinna know, lad, but we must remember that this is Mars. There are strange things here on this planet, things that no man can guess. The Martian committed suicide. That was strange, and those ruby jewels are very strange. But why were our engines stopped? We were deliberately marooned here? Well, we can't begin to guess at motivations, McIlrath replied uneasily. This isn't Earth. The creatures of this planet may have entirely different reasons for their acts than we have. You done? Okay. Then the first shot came. Bang! The second one came right behind it. Somebody was using a gun. His first shot had missed, but he had taken dead aim to make certain the second one did not miss. Bang! 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 3 more shots followed closely on the heels of the second. Whoever was using a gun had missed with the second. Now he was emptying the weapon at a charging enemy. It's in the main control room, Sparks said. Come on. Yanking his pistol from its holster, he raced down the corridor. McIlrath came right behind him. They almost ran over Sutter as he came out of the galley, a gun in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. The archaeologist brought up the rear. Sparks kicked open the door. Orzati lay on the floor. Sparks did not need to see the sick agony on his face to know Orzati was dead or dying. Frome was alive. He stood stiffly erect, his feet wide apart, taking aim with his pistol. Flame lanced from the muzzle, and the sharp thunder of the shot smashed through the room. He yanked the trigger again, and the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. With a single motion of his arm, he threw the weapon at the thing coming at him, as one does. And here's the illustration, by the way. That's our guy. Whoops. There we go. Ah! Oh no! Ooh. Yes. Oh, but yes. Mm-hmm. The sight paralyzed the radio operator. What he saw was impossible. The thing that moved toward Frome was a 2-foot ball of reddish gas. That was me, sorry. A globe of swirling gas, lit with baleful red brilliance. The thing glittered with microscopic pinpoints of light. It made a sound as it moved, a high-pitched note like the whine of a distant motor generator.
Not like that?
Exactly like that. Okay. There were 2 of the gas balls. One of them was darting toward Frome. The other was down on the floor on Orzati's body, and the whine coming from it held a gloating note like a ghoul feeding. Seriously, it's like my Yellow Lab's gas, really. Yeah, I know.
It's true.
Oh, it's deadly. Everything happened in split seconds. A gas ball streaked toward Frome. A thundering explosion smashed Sparks' eardrums. He saw a pistol poked past him, and he knew that McIlrath was firing over his shoulder. He jerked up his own gun, and the 2 pistols spat a salvo. The gas ball flinched as the bullets hit it, wavered, and dodged. That's the medicine, Sparks shouted. Hot lead. Oh, I should read that again. That's the medicine, Sparks shouted. Hot lead. Again, cold read. I don't know, 50s lingo. Before the 3rd shot had left the gun, he knew that the weapon was useless. The gas ball flinched as the slugs hit it, but they passed through it unimpeded. It struck Frome on the chest, clung to him like a leech. His hands jerked up to tear it away, but as it touched him, his whole body seemed to be paralyzed. His arms fell limply. A look of startled agony writhed over his face. His eyes popped open in sudden horror. He screamed and slumped to the floor. As he fell, he saw the radio operator standing in the doorway. Close that door, he gasped. Barricade yourself behind it. Sparks didn't move to obey him. Save yourselves, the weak words came. Never mind us, we're done for. The voice found strength in some hidden sources, and Captain Frome rasped out his final command. That's an order! Obey it! He was the captain. His authority was final. Obey it, Sparks snarled. He leaped into the room, McIlrath and Sutter right behind him. What happened next was always afterwards a blur in Sparks's mind. As a boy, he had fought bumblebees in the meadows of Earth. What? No, it literally says that. As a boy, he had fought bumblebees in the meadows of Earth.
The bees!
Beep! This was something like fighting bumblebees, except that this bee was deadly. Slapping, slugging at the reddish mass of gas on Frome's chest, they tried to tear it loose. To touch it sent jarring needles of pain up their arms. Their hands smashed through it. It swirled and reformed. But when the fight was over, Captain Frome was on one side of the door, and a reddish mass of gas was singing angrily on the other. Sparks was turning back to the door. When he came out the second time, he had Orzati's body in his arms. He had enough strength left to lay the biochemist down, then his legs buckled under him, and he collapsed. When he recovered consciousness, the old engineer was dribbling water into his mouth. He tried to sit back up, but McIlrath pushed him back. Lie still, lad, until you get your strength back. But those gas balls! Lie still, and I'll tell you what we've decided about them. But what are they? Forward in the control room, whining to each other. It's weird punctuation there, but okay. Forward in the control room, whining to each other. Captain Frome thinks he has found out what they are. Captain Frome? How is he? Weak as a kitten, but we think he'll live. He says the gas balls came from the ruby jewels, that while he and Orzati were working with the crystals, they suddenly turned to gas right before their eyes. But that's impossible! The old Scot shook his head. Captain Frome says the gas balls and the crystals are two different forms of the same life species. He thinks they're similar to the cocoon and the butterfly that we know back on Earth. The crystal is the cocoon stage. The ball of gas is the butterfly stage. He says he thinks that they live on radiant energy and that they attack our engines and us for the same reason. But Sparks choked off his protest. Frome was a thoroughly capable physicist, and he was not given to idle statements. If he made a statement, he had a good reason to back it up. What connection is there between our engines and us? Well, there's this connection, lad. The source of power in our engines is the radioactivity of the uranium atom. The source of the energy that keeps the human heart beating is the element potassium, which is slightly radioactive. If you remove the uranium from our engines, they won't generate power. If you remove the potassium from our bodies, our heart stops beating. But the uranium was not removed from the engines, and the bodies of the dead men show no marks of any kind. How was the potassium removed without leaving a mark? Well, it's not the uranium or the potassium that's removed. Captain Frome says that these gas balls live on the radioactive emanations, the alpha, beta, and gamma rays, discharged by these elements, leaving them inert. Just as a leech sucks blood, they suck the radioactive discharges. Are you feeling better now, lad? Sparks sat up. A wave of dizziness sent his head spinning, but he forced himself to his feet and walked over to where Captain Frome lay on the floor. Frome's eyes were closed, and he was breathing in slow, gasping sobs. Sutter was bending over Frome. His heart is barely beating, the archaeologist said. Those things almost sucked the life out of him. Sparks said nothing. He walked to the nearest port and looked out. Swift dusk was falling over Mars. Sharp shadows were creeping over the city. Blobs of darkness were huddling behind the buildings. Night was coming over the city where, for centuries, the Red Death had patiently waited for the last of the Martians to awaken. The men of Mars had not taken refuge in frozen sleep to escape a drought cycle. They had fled from a deadly enemy. The Martian had committed suicide when he saw that jewel glittering in the sunlight at the entrance to the cavern. He had known what it was. He had preferred to die by his own hand rather than face a more agonizing death. A movement in the shadows caught his eyes. He looked again to make certain he had not been mistaken. Then he saw what it was. A ball of red gas drifting along a foot above the sand. It came out of the shadow and moved directly towards the ship. Another dead butterfly had emerged. Another cocoon had burst. But they were safe. The stout steel hull of the ship would protect them until a rescue expedition could arrive. They had plenty of food and water. Even if 1,000 cocoons released their drifting death, they could not get through the walls of the ship. Someone breathed heavily behind him. Turning, Sparks saw Angus looking out over his shoulder. The old engineer squinted at the drifting ball of gas. Another one? I was afraid there would be others. Those two behind that door in the control room have been squealing as if they were calling to others of their kind.
Ooh.
Yeah. Do you think they can call others?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know, lad. Back on Earth, the moths do it, and I doubt if yon red devil came back here because of idle curiosity. The radio operator followed the red monstrosity as it drifted out of sight. He shivered and said, "Well, we're safe here." "About that, I didn't know either," McIlrath answered, shaking his head. It was not so much what he said, but the way he said it, that sent a sudden chill to the radio operator's heart. But Angus refused to answer his questions. Instead, the engineer led him down the corridor to the control room. The door was still blocked. It was a stout sheet of aluminum alloy. First day with the new lips. Putty had been plastered around the cracks. "While you were still unconscious," McIlrath explained, "those devils began to ooze through the cracks between the edges of the door and the facing. We stopped them up with a bit of putty, but..." "But what?" Sparks exploded. "You surely don't think they can come through that door?" "I think they can't, lad," the old Scot answered. "But I remember that door the Martians built to seal their cavern. It was at least a foot thick, but the outer surface was pitted with holes that were almost 6 inches deep, as if something had tried to eat its way through the barrier and had failed. It wasn't rust either, for in this dry desert, metal was scarcely rust. So something else must have eaten these holes in that door, and the only thing they could have done..." He broke off to stare, in slowly mounting horror, at the door they were facing. At the same instant, Sparks saw what was happening. A tiny smudge had appeared on the gray surface. It looked like a little drop of acid. It was about the size of a dime, and it was growing in size. As it grew, it turned distinctly reddish. Indeed. "They're eating their way through the door," Sparks whispered. He started to slap at the reddish spot, but McIlrath knocked his hand away. The engineer seized a wad of putty from the floor and slapped it over the spot. It ceased growing. On the other side of the door, an angry whine sounded. "That stops you this time," he grunted. "Yes, but how long?" Sparks whispered. McIlrath didn't answer. Sutter came running through the corridor. "I just wanted to tell you," he panted. "There are a lot of these things outside. They're doing something to the glass in the portholes, and..." They didn't wait for him to finish, but raced back to the stern of the ship. A glance showed that the archaeologist was right. Dozens of blobs of glistening gas floated over the ship. A few were clamped over the glass of the ports. Under the action of some acid they secreted, it was flaking away. Nobody said anything, but they each knew that doom was coming towards them. Slowly but surely, the glass in the ports would be disintegrated. If they closed the ports with metal, the monstrosities would eat through the metal. There was no place in the ship that promised safety, with the possible exception of the cook's galley, which was in the heart of the ship and protected by metal barriers on all sides. In time, even those barriers would fall. "There must be some way to whip them," Sparks grated. Sutter was twitching as if he had the palsy. Only the old engineer was calm, and he spread his hands in a hopeless gesture. "Yes, lad, there probably is, but guns didn't work." "Sparks," a weak voice whispered. The radio operator jerked around to see who was calling him. He saw Captain Frome. The captain had spoken. "What's happening?" The radio man told him. Frome sighed. "I wish I could suggest something, but I can't. Too weak to even think. So I'm turning everything over to you, lad." "To me?" "Yes. I ought to put you under arrest for disobeying me when I told you to save yourself. Instead, I'm putting you in charge of the remnants of this expedition. I'm not doing this just because you showed initiative and daring when you saved my life, but because you're old find a way or make one Avery's son. He never let anything stop him, and you're his son. You'll get us out of this mess, if anybody can."
Oh.
We have another illustration. Pause for illustration. There we go. It's some little doodads and the crystals and all the balls. Look at all the balls rising up.
Wow.
They got stuff. Keep his skin. scared of the balls.
Scary balls.
Scary balls. You don't want those. The radio man's mind was reeling. Captain Frome was telling him that he was the boss. But what about McIlrath and Sutter? Will they? I think they will, but let them answer for themselves. Sutter nodded nervously. I don't care what's done as long as we get out of here alive. McIlrath said simply, I followed your father, lad. You're his own true son. I won't hesitate to follow you. The surge of exultation that leapt up in Sparks was drowned in the recognition of his new responsibility. Before, he had been taking orders. Now he was giving them. He well knew that Frome had another reason for designating him as the acting captain. Sutter and McIlrath were both too old to respond quickly in an emergency. He was young, his reactions timed to split seconds. If they were to escape alive, they had to have a leader who could react instantly. He stood up. We'll carry Captain Frome into the galley. It's the best protected spot of the ship. We'll take all our emergency equipment in there. We'll plug the porthole with putty, and then after that... But he didn't finish the sentence. He knew the metal walls of the galley would yield in time. After they had carried everything into the galley, Sparks came back to the stern. McIlrath followed him. What are you planning to do, lad? He asked quietly. Makes you think I'm planning anything, Sparks answered sharply. You've got the same quiet ferocity in your eyes that your father had. When he was planning something dangerous and didn't intend to tell anybody about it, he looked just exactly like you do now. Yeah, Sparks rasped. Well, I am planning something, but you can't stop me. You heard what Frome said. I'm in charge now. The engineer's eyes did not falter. You needn't remind me of that, lad. I'm not trying to stop you. But if I know what it is you're doing, I might be able to help you. Oh, the radio man answered. I am planning something. I didn't tell you because I was afraid you might kick about it. I think it was too dangerous. Or you might think it was too dangerous. But it's the only way I can see for us to have even a chance to get out of here alive. And what is that, lad? McIlrath asked quietly. You remember my father had a saying, Sparks answered. For every evil, nature provides a virtue. For every poison, there's an antidote. For every disease, there's a cure. Somewhere. There is something that will whip these gas balls. Something that will destroy them. They've got a weakness somewhere. Yeah, I also remember the rest of that saying. Nature provides a way to cure everything that goes wrong. But she doesn't hand you that cure on a silver platter. You've got to find it yourself. I don't doubt, but there's a way to whip these vandals, lad. But how are we going to find it in the few hours we've got left? The old engineer's face was wrinkled into a frown of pleading perplexity. This story is oddly appropriate. By going to the only possible source of information, the Martians themselves. They fought these things for centuries. If anybody knows what to do to lick them, the Martians do. Don't lick gas balls. That's my rule number 4. Good advice. But they lost, McIlrath protested. They hid away in a hole. If they had known how to whip their enemy, they would have done it. The radio man's youthful face clouded. I've thought of that, he said desperately. But maybe they ran out of ammunition to fight with. The fact that they put their city in order shows that they expected these radium suckers to be gone when they awakened. Anyhow, there are only hope. We can either take a chance that they'll know how to whip them, or we can sit here and die waiting. I'm not going to sit here and wait for one of those things to suck the life out of me. I'm going after a Martian. And this one, he finished grimly, won't commit suicide before we get a chance to talk to him. But lad... but 3 seconds later. But lad, Sparks snarled, I'm going. He thought the engineer meant to protest his going because he would have to run the gauntlet of the growing number of balls outside. But McIlrath had no such intention. The old Scot knew very well that death lurked outside, but the threat of death had never stopped Richard Avery, nor would it stop his son. It wouldn't stop McIlrath either. Very calmly, he insisted on going along. Sparks' voice softened. I think, Angus, you'd better stay here and help me through the emergency lock. Aye, lad, McIlrath answered. I'll be waiting for you. So Sparks waited until deep darkness had fallen. Then he slipped through the lock. A globe of witchfire floated outside. Sparks eyed it. All over his body he felt his skin writhe. What if one of those things caught him? He knew the answer to that. His heart would stop beating just as Orzati's heart had stopped, just as he watched the gas ball. It floated towards the stern of the ship. He slipped to the sand and dropped on his face, crawling up against the hull. A thin whine sounded as another of the creatures passed. Or perhaps it was the same one. Perhaps it had sensed his presence and had returned. He held his breath. Death went by. He waited until everything was clear and then dashed across the sand. Panting for breath in the thin, dry air, he reached the shelter of the buildings and saw a luminosity coming toward him. He dived headfirst into the sand. Dust rose in choking clouds. The gas ball passed. He lay still, fighting for breath. The dust irritated his nostrils. He began to worm his way forward. 2 hours later, he was back at the ship, a bound and gagged Martian over his shoulder. He took one look at the vessel and his heart sank. It was surrounded by hundreds of balls of fire mist, swirling over the hull, squirming against the ports, eating their way through the food that lay inside. Eating their way through to the food that lay inside. Sorry, folks. Hundreds of them, and others were coming. Had they already penetrated the hull? He lay down flat on his face and began to worm his way across the open space, the Martian still over his shoulder. The Martian had seen the gas balls. He was whimpering like a badly frightened child. Would he reach the ship, or would they see him and dart at him in a swarming cloud? He was now only 10 feet from the flyer. A quick dash would take him to the lock. He took a deep breath and lifted himself for the dash. Then it happened. A gas ball, passing over him, suddenly whined angrily and looped back toward him, hovering over him like a buzzard investigating carrion. Other luminosities, attracted by the action of the first one, came swirling downward. They had discovered him. It was the end. He didn't have a chance in a million. The gas balls were darting at him from all directions. He leapt to his feet, tried to race towards the emergency lock, knowing he couldn't make it. He tripped and fell. Everything went black. He couldn't see. Dimly he wondered, did death come like this? A sudden rushing blackness. He felt no pain. Something touched him. He screamed. A sharp voice said, "This way, lad!" Sparks gulped in thankfulness. McIlrath! He knew now what had happened. The engineer had been watching from the lock. A smoke projector ready. That rushing wave of blackness was smoke. Smoke! He could hear the gas balls whining as they groped through it. McIlrath guided him to the lock. The outer door clanged shut behind them. In all his life, Sparks had never been so miserable. When he had succeeded in returning to the ship with the Martian, he thought they now had a chance to live. Instead, he had learned they were doomed. Doomed! 2 hours had passed since he returned. They were all in the cramped galley. Death was eating at the walls around them, death that was now only minutes off. "I tried to tell you when you left, lad," McIlrath said softly. "But you thought I was trying to keep you from going. You wouldn't listen." "Yeah, I know," said Sparks glumly, "but I didn't think about this. All I could think of was that maybe the Martians knew some way to fight these fiends." "Yeah, I know, lad," McIlrath answered. "Don't be feeling bad about it. 'Twas a brave thing that you did, and maybe they do know some way." "Yeah," Sparks answered gloomily. "Maybe they do." He glanced across the galley at the Martian. He was alive, all right, scared half to death, but alive. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, his arms and legs bound. His bright, fear-filled eyes darted restlessly over the room. Occasionally he said something in a high, sing-song tone of voice. He knew what was eating through the hulls of the ship, and he might know something to do about it. Every time he spoke, he might be telling them how to whip the radium suckers. The trouble was, they couldn't understand what he said.
Mm-hmm.
The men of Earth and the men of Mars had met under desperate circumstances with the future of the planet depending on them, and they couldn't understand each other. The languages were different. John Orms, the language expert, had spent 11 years trying to crack the written Martian language and had failed. In time, now that they had found a Martian, they would be able to understand each other, but there wasn't time. Seconds ticked away into nothingness. A red blot appeared on the wall of the galley. McIlrath slapped a wad of putty over it and looked down at the diminishing supply. There was very little putty left. Sutter twitched nervously. McIlrath calmly sat down. Sparks glowered at the Martian. To have safety so near and yet so far away, it was maddening. Frome, lying on the floor, tried to sit up and fell back. "Could I," he whispered, "have a drink of water?" They had plenty of water. Sparks drew a cupful from the cooler. The eyes of the Martian followed him as he lifted Frome to a sitting position. The captain drank. "Any luck, lad?" he asked weakly. "No," Sparks answered, "but we're not finished yet. There's some way to lick these things, and I know it." He rose to his feet. He was lying to himself, trying to lie to them. They were finished. When the rescue expedition came after them, as it certainly would, it would be finished too. The bones of men would lie with the bones of Martians in the dry deserts, in the dust of the deserted cities. The exploration of the planet, so bravely begun, might well end here. The labor of the men who had fought space to reach Mars, the daring of the pioneers who had braved the deserts, would have resulted only in death. Then Sutter screamed, an inarticulate screech, the yell of a man who has seen death coming and knows he cannot stop it. A red dot the size of the end of a lead pencil had appeared on the outer wall. It began to grow in size. Slowly the archaeologist slumped to the floor. He had fainted. The pressure was too much for him. They let him lie. Death would come easier if he didn't know it was coming. The red dot grew. The galley was silent. In the silence, men breathed heavily. The Martian screeched. Another red dot had appeared on the wall. "Shut up," Sparks rasped. "We're all in the same boat." He broke off to stare at the Martian. A sudden savage hope sent his heart pounding. The Martian seemed to be having a fit. He was twisting and turning and trying to free himself from his bonds. His eyes were darting continuously from the two men to another object in the room. He looked like a dog trying to warn his master that a grizzly bear is lurking on the trail ahead. And like a dog, he could only tell what he knew by howling and begging with his eyes. "He's trying to tell us something," Sparks whispered tensely. He leapt across the galley and cut the ropes that bound the native. The Martian struggled to his feet. He leapt across the room toward... Sparks caught his breath. The water cooler. He drew a cupful of the liquid, turned and splashed it across the red dots growing on the wall. Something hissed like an angry snake, hissed and drew away. The dots stopped growing. "Water," Sparks gulped. "The one thing this planet has always needed and never had. Water. Those gas balls have evolved in a desert. They can't stand water. It kills them. Sutter was right. The Martians went into frozen sleep because their water supply had given out. The answer was right under our eyes all the time. The very dust that choked us should have told us what to do." He was screaming now. "There's always a cure for every evil, but you gotta find that cure, and we found it. Take that, and that!" He was splashing water on the walls, wetting them down. McIlrath and the Martian were helping him. The putty began to slip and fall away. Luminosities tried to surge through the holes, but when the water struck them, they sizzled like a skillet full of hot grease, burst into steam, and steaming died. Skillet full of hot grease. Now I want bacon. Two Earthmen and a Martian fought side by side, and they used as a weapon the one thing of which Mars for centuries had never had enough: water. When the rescue ship came knifing down out of the sky, the surprised captain found 4 weary, happy Earthmen to greet him. 2 of them supported the man he recognized as captain of his ill-fated expedition, but when he came to greet Frome, it was Sparks who stepped forward and gravely saluted. "Avery, sir, acting captain of the rescue ship Kepler, reporting." The puzzled captain acknowledged his salute. They told him what had happened. "I get that," he said. "You did a swell job, but..." He gestured towards the other group. "Who are these?" "The men of Mars," Sparks announced. "We found them." They had awakened the Martians from frozen sleep. They stood in a group apart from the Earthmen. "But what's the matter with them?" the captain asked. What are they acting like that for?" The Martians were waving their hands in the air, turning somersaults, twisting and contorting their bodies. "They're trying to tell you how happy they are to see you," Sparks answered. "They haven't learned how to talk to us yet, but they sure know how to make signs." The end. So water saves the day.
That was awesome.
Way to steal an idea. M. Night Shyamalan Ding Dong with the water thing and the movie he did that in, which if you haven't seen it, I won't reveal which one it is.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to actually look at the camera when doing this thing, as opposed to looking at myself sitting down there. But so yes, this has been Keith and Daisy doing a cold read. Sorry for all my stuttering and stuff, but that was me reading something I'd never, read before. So, hooray. And hopefully I can do another one a little bit later. I'm thinking of doing a fairy tale, perhaps, or maybe just something else from the book. I really hope that that I did the video right, because otherwise it's going to really piss me off that I just spent however many hours doing this. All right, the end.